Hi, I'm Aldo. Welcome to Plays the Thing, the channel where I share my experiences prepping and playing tabletop role-playing games. And today is game night. We're gonna gather tonight, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and play something. What and with whom, I'm not sure. Because remember, I have shifted to my new approach to game night, which is that I'm no longer scheduling specific games or specific people at specific times. Our lives are just too complicated to be able to make that work. So my new approach is that over the course of the week, I'm prepping a bunch of things. And then on the morning of game day, I send a text and say, hey, these are the things that I can run. So this morning I sent the text saying that I can run Shadowdark Freeport, which is a game that we started when we had our big in-person extravaganza at the beginning of the summer. I can run Modern Age, the Conservancy, which is where the characters play modern day agents for an organization that is fighting off incursions from other dimensions. And then I can just do a pickup game in basic fantasy role-playing. If we get a bunch of people that don't quite fit either of those other two games at the table tonight, and they're willing to just kind of roll with it, we can just make quick characters in basic fantasy role-playing. I can throw something together really quickly for that without much prep, and that's that. So those are the three things that I said I could do. I am also more than happy to play in any game that they want to bring. Last week, for example, my friend Jason ran Cyberpunk, and I actually don't really like Cyberpunk as a genre or an idiom, but I had a blast playing. So I'm so grateful that we did that, and I'm happy to do something like that again today. But anyway, in response to that text that I sent this morning, I did see some excitement for Shadowdark Freeport, and so I figured that this video could be a play report of what we've done in that game so far. So this will probably be the first in a playlist as we go through that adventure series. So let me get you oriented to the game by presenting the characters to you. Again, we started this over in Georgia. We played in person, and Alex made Gethier the Ranger. He's a human ranger, and he is unique in that he is really kind of a coastal or maritime ranger. So he's often on ships and he knows how to make his way through those environments. We have another character who is Nicodeme, the thief, played by Mike. And Nicodeme is just, well, what you'd expect. He's a thief. We didn't really get too deep into backgrounds. We're just figuring these guys out as we go. My wife, Lauren, made a human fighter named Cora, or Red, because she has red hair. So she's been called Red Cora recently, kind of like Red Sonja, I guess. But she is somebody who is often inebriated, very, very, very strong, and very, very impulsive. Also has a maritime thing going. And I think, if I remember correctly, Cora's father was a pirate who is lost at sea, but at one point had left Cora with a treasure map of some sort. And she is carrying that with her. In fact, when they ended up in Freeport, the party had kind of gathered together to maybe try to find something having to do with her father, but they got kind of stranded in Freeport and have been doing stuff there ever since. Jen made Saralia, a human cleric. She is a cleric to a god of knowledge. And I think we're using Ord. Yes, we are using Ord, the god of knowledge from Shadowdark. And then Dan made Sue, or Scalawag Sue. I know that she has a more high-class name because she's actually a noble. I don't remember that name right now, but I know that she does. And she fled an arranged marriage and took to a life at the sea. And we're using the optional duelist class that was created by a third-party creator for her. Then Dano made Tor Delkin, a ranger. And Tor Delkin is a very traditional ranger in the sense that he's a lot more about forests, and we figured that he got pulled into the party for personal reasons. Again, we're figuring all that out as we play rather than pre-scripting anything. So with the characters introduced, let me tell you what happened in their first adventure in Freeport. As I said before, the adventurers had come together to follow Cora's inherited treasure map, However, the merchant vessel that they were on was forced to strand them in Freeport when a shipment of grain spoiled and they couldn't continue with their mission, so they left the group penniless in this bustling port city. While orienting themselves and exploring the docks, the party was attacked by a press gang that was seeking able-bodied ship crews. They handily defeated the would-be kidnappers, and it was shortly after that they were approached by Brother Egil, who's a young cleric who was impressed by what they did and therefore offered them a job. And the job was for them to find his missing friend Lucius, who was a librarian from the temple of the god of knowledge of Ord, who had disappeared 2 days prior. So right there we had a nice link to Saralia. You know, Egil and Saralia were already kind of on the same page in terms of their god. And Saralia was interested in checking out the temple of their god anyway, so that was a nice connection. The party, of course, immediately accepted Egil's offer and they began to investigate. And first they went to Lucius's home, which was a little house tucked away in the middle of a kind of a crowded street. And there they found a few things. They found Lucius's to-do list, which included meeting up with a Captain Scarbelly. They weren't sure who Captain Scarbelly was, but they had a name that they could find out more about. And then Alex had Gethier examine the texts that Lucius had on the table. And these were geographical texts that kind of spanned the whole world. And he started asking more specific questions about that material to see if he can figure out any patterns of what Lucius might have been thinking of. And this is something that is not covered in the adventure, but I knew what had happened, of course, to Lucius and what his mindset had been in the days before he was abducted. So I had him make a roll, and Gethier rolled a natural 20. I think it was like a wisdom check. And I told him that the geographical texts that were on the table revealed that the librarian had been frantically attempting to synthesize contradictory lore from multiple sources into a single work. And Gethier is not a scholar, but he is a ranger that has maritime experience, and he would know about all these different maps and locations just from that. And I basically just had him intuit this by putting together all of the different pieces that he could find and seeing some of Lucius's own drawings. This is stuff that's not in the adventure, but I figured that it would honor Alex's inquiry, and it just made sense for him to be able to pick this up. So after that, the group split their efforts. Sister Saralia went alone to the temple to make inquiries, carefully dropping Lucius's name while researching in the geography section to see if she can find anything that would back up what Gethier had figured out. Her cautious approach was important because there is a character there that could notice any overt questioning about Lucius, and that is Milos, who is really kind of the mastermind of this particular adventure. But because Saralia was very careful, Milos did not become immediately hostile. Instead, he decided that he would order his spies to watch her and to gather information about her rather than attack her, as is written in the adventure. While Saralia was doing that, the rest of the party decided that they were going to investigate the docks. They started trying to find out who Captain Scarbelly was, and they found out that he was a pirate whose ship, the Bloody Vengeance, was in the port. Gethier and a couple of the other player characters then boldly strode up to the gangplank and confronted the two crewmen that were guarding it and asked them directly about Lucius and about Scarbelly. The crew was hostile but not aggressive. They basically dismissed them and told them to screw off, and the party wisely chose not to assault the orcs. I mean, there were more orcs than there were player characters, and they decided that caution was the better part of valor. While that was going on, Sue was doing her own thing, just kind of hanging out in the market, and she ran across a vendor that was selling a trained monkey, and she bought that monkey and named it Captain Jack. So now she has a pet monkey. So after that round of investigation, the party decided to regroup at the inn. It was an inn that Egil had recommended to them. And as they gathered there, or as they were walking up there, they noticed that they were being followed by a tall, thin man in robes, and they kept their cool. They all went into the inn, they sat at a table, and then they watched as this guy walked in, scanned the room, and made contact with them. They made eye contact with the guy and motioned him over, and the fellow who had been following them looked kind of shocked that he'd been made, but tried to play it cool, so he came over and he sat with them. And they didn't mince any words. They directly confronted him and said, "What are you doing? Who are you working for? Why are you following us? What's all this all about?" And the man who'd introduced himself as Belko looked shaken and managed to excuse himself before the party did anything violent to him, and he left the building. Nicodeme, the thief, and both Gethier and Tordelkin, the rangers, then decided to slip out and tail Belko, and they managed to do so unnoticed. They saw as Belko dipped into some alleys and met with some guys who were wearing leather armor and carrying weapons and carrying yellow shields, and watched as Belko led the armored men to a dilapidated building in a rundown part of town, made some gestures in front of the door. The door opened for them. They went in, and then the door closed. So the player characters made a mental note of that and returned to the inn. The next day saw simultaneous action on two fronts. Saralia returned to the temple. This time her questioning was a little bit more aggressive, which prompted Milos to order her assassination. Meanwhile, the rest of the party broke into that abandoned house that Belko and the others had gone into, and after a little bit of investigation, they found a wine cellar and they found a secret entrance through one of the large wine casks, which revealed a staircase that descended into an underground temple complex. This was important because no sooner had Milos ordered his agents to kill Saralia that he was alerted by a magical alarm that secret door had been opened. And that meant that Milos immediately teleported to the site where the rest of the party was, and he navigated the underground chambers to rile up and prepare the forces that he had there at his disposal. While he was doing that, the party pressed into the temple complex, but not without some difficulty. Red fell into a pit trap, but was quickly rescued. And while she was being rescued, Nicodeme located the secret passage that led into some cave systems that were connected to the temple complex. After they rescued Red, the party then decided to go through that cave system rather than go through the temple complex itself. As they made their way through those cave tunnels, they came face to face with a bunch of serpent people that Milos had sent to ambush the party. And so combat was locked in a relatively narrow space, which proved a little bit tricky. Meanwhile, as the main party engaged the serpent people in the underground tunnels, Saralia faced her own crisis above ground. The first thing I should say is that she left the temple and went to go meet the rest of the party for lunch. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen. They were not going to meet that scheduled appointment. What I should say though is that before they went into the wine cask secret doorway, Sue had sent Captain Jack, her trained monkey, to find Saralia and bring her to the rest of the party. So as Saralia was making her way down the streets, I had her run into two things. The first was Egil, who was wanting to rendezvous with her after she had her second visit in the temple. So he approached her with questions about what she discovered, and then he also showed her that he was carrying a mace and that he had been so inspired by the character's own heroism and bravery that he wanted to follow in their footsteps. Right after that, I had Captain Jack, the monkey, approach Saralia and pull at her robes, trying to get her to go to where the rest of the party was, but she wasn't particularly responsive. One of the reasons being that she spotted the Yellow Shield's mercenaries, including Belko, surrounding them in the street, and she was trying to find a way of getting out of their maneuver and ultimately ended up face to face with them. So she pulled out her hammer, Egil pulled out his mace, and the battle was joined. Captain Jack, the monkey, actually proved instrumental during the fight when Belko failed a spell roll with a natural 1, which caused a magic worm to sort of start eating up his spells. And while that was happening, Captain Jack started tearing at him and stuff. So it was a really kind of grisly end to the wizard, while Saralia and Egil fought off the remaining mercenaries through teamwork and through divine magic. There were a couple of healing spells that were thrown back and forth between them as they fought off like 4 mercenaries. It was a pretty impressive fight, and one of those cool and somewhat rare moments where a character basically gets to stand one-on-one against an overwhelming force and pull it out. I know she had some help from NPCs, but Saralia was really the one that stood her ground in that moment. So it was cool. While that was happening, the underground party fought their way through the Serpent people that they were fighting in the tunnels, and they reached Milos's inner sanctum. The final battle there saw the companions facing off against the cult leader himself, his 2 very well-armed and beefy attendants, and a few remaining Serpent people. Gethir and Tor opened the battle by providing covering fire with their bows, while Red charged directly at Milos and dealt a severe blow with her bastard sword. Unfortunately for her, Milos attacked her with 2 attacks and rolled a natural 20 and struck her down, putting her in a situation where she only had rounds to live. Scalawag Sue then leaped into melee to protect her downed friend and struck down Milos with a dramatic double strike of her own. Then, turning to the surviving attendants, she said, "Run." And I had them make a morale check. They failed, and they did indeed run. Now, this was a dramatic moment in a lot of ways because Red only had rounds to live. Tordelkin ran over to her to try to bring her back with some of his curatives that he has as a ranger, but he failed his roll. He was getting ready to try to stabilize her with one of his less effective curatives, but it was really the last round and we didn't know how this was going to go. And Lauren rolled that d20 and rolled a natural 20 and stabilized herself. So Red fortunately lived. So Milos's death revealed his true nature. He was a serpent person who had been masquerading as a human for years, and his body morphed into its natural state. The party then searched the temple complex and they found a few things. First, they found Lucius tortured and tied up, but alive in one of the temple rooms. They also found the cult's treasury, which they looted. When they got back to the inn, they reunited Lucius with Egil, and at that point, Lucius shared his full story. 6 years earlier, he had been possessed by an extra-planar entity and lost all cognizance of anything that was happening to him, or at least to his body. Apparently, that extra-planar entity used his body to travel the world for 5 years, exploring lands far and wide, and then left his body, so that a year ago, Lucius regained consciousness, found himself somewhere completely alien to him with a collection of books that the entity had collected over his time exploring the world. And obviously, Lucius was very, very confused by this. He managed to convince the people that he was traveling with to bring him back to Freeport, and he used the library that he had accumulated as his extra-planar entity to bring himself back into the fold at the temple. But then he started having nightmares about what had happened, and he wanted to know what he had actually done over those years. So he had started to ask questions of people like Captain Scarbelly, who apparently he had traveled with way back in the day, to try to piece together his forgotten past. And it was these questions that alerted Milos to the fact that Lucius had some sort of connection to otherworldly entities, and Milos wanted that information for his own benefit. And that's what had led Milos to kidnap Lucius to try to get that information out of him, which of course Lucius couldn't provide the information because he actually didn't remember it. And that's what had set off this whole thing. Now, a lot of that information the party sort of knew, because when Egil hired them, he had said, yeah, my friend Lucius, who had been gone for 5 years, and then he came back and he seemed back to his old self, but then things started to go weird. He started to have nightmares. He started to look nervous, and then he disappeared. That much the player characters had known, but they didn't know the stuff about the extra-planar entity and all of that other backstory. So Lucius left them with that. And that is how we wrapped up our first session of Shadowdark Freeport. You know, when I started this recording, my intention was to provide a summary of our first 2 adventures. But this has turned out to be longer than I intended, so I think I'm going to cut it there, and I'll make a separate video to give you the second adventure, hopefully before we play tonight. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for sticking around until the end. And as always, I wish you good health. I wish you good cheer. I wish you good gaming. Goodbye.